hear the facts, people will say, well, he was better than Obama, Bush was. Yeah, I agree. Castro, in many respects, has been better than Obama when it comes to spending and so forth. But that's not the test, whether somebody's better than Obama, because virtually every one of Obama's predecessors was better than Obama. The test is that when the Republicans controlled all three branches, both branches and all three elements within those three branches, because this is what they say they need. What did they do? We're not talking about the last 100 years. We're talking about the presidency prior to the existing one. And the Cato Institute took a look at this several years ago. Chris Edwards, he looked at the Congressional Budget Office final budget numbers for fiscal 2009. And those numbers, he said, allow us to take a look at the Bush administration's record on spending. We have to keep this in mind when we have moderate Republicans who keep telling us, and people on TV who keep telling us we have to win before we fight. We have to win in order to make changes. And what I'm saying is we have to fight in order to win. So, he writes, George W. Bush's last year was fiscal 2009. Now, the guy's very fair. He says outlays that year were $3.522 trillion, according to the Congressional Budget Office, so $3.5 trillion. He says, but $100 billion was spending for the 2009 economic stimulus under Obama, that portion of it. So he says, so Bush was really responsible for about $3.4 trillion in spending in 2009, which includes outlays for the financial bailouts enacted under his watch. And you may not remember this, but he had financial bailouts of GM and Chrysler. He was the first. Fannie and Freddie, TARP. Bush also had stimulus spending, and you may forget that too. Spending in Bush's first year, fiscal year 2001, was $1.86 trillion. So he presided over an 83% increase in overall federal spending. 83%. Now that included defense, domestic, entitlements, and interest. And even without TARP and Fannie and Freddie, spending was up a huge 70% under Bush over 8 years. Now, you're not going to like what I'm going to tell you. By contrast, total spending under 8 years of Clinton increased 32%. That's thanks to, in my humble opinion, Newt Gingrich and Republican control of the House. Isn't it amazing? Newt Gingrich, not Johnny Boehner, Newt Gingrich and Republican control of the House of Representatives. He goes on. George W. Bush was the biggest spender since Lyndon Baines Johnson. His spending increases were far larger than the three prior presidents. Now, he says, of course, presidents share spending power with Congress, and it's easier for presidents to control discretionary spending than entitlement spending. However, the results in these, and they have charts, which I won't get into, in the charts reflect the general spending approach taken by the presidents quite well. For example, George W. Bush was instrumental in adding the Medicare drug benefit, which by 2009 was adding more than $60 billion a year to federal spending. Now, he didn't add it himself. Congress supported it. So when they say, give us a chance to run the government, and we will rip out Obamacare by its roots, these are the same people who expanded Medicare, even though the trustees and actuaries for Medicare said then and say today that this is unsustainable. Federal spending without interest payments. Presidents have the least discretionary control over interest. The biggest spenders by this measure, without interest, were Lyndon Baines Johnson and again George W. Bush. In fact, George W. Bush's record was worse than Johnson's. Then he says he took out both interest payments and defense spending. So we remove interest payments and defense spending so we can look at what is essentially domestic spending, domestic discretionary spending, and so-called entitlement spending. So mostly spending, if you will, on what is referred to as the welfare state. By this measure, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, and Nixon had awful records. These were the years of massive creation and expansion of federal subsidy programs for the elderly, state governments, and many other groups. And by the late 1970s, the creation of new programs had slowed, but existing programs continued to grow. Now listen to this. The 1980 election of Ronald Reagan represented a revolt against the rapidly expanding welfare state. His record shows just a 1% real spending growth over 8 years for non-defense, non-interest payment spending. 1%. And they said it's a remarkable record compared to presidents in the last half century. But what about George W. Bush? He was the biggest domestic spender since Richard Nixon. He set the stage for the explosive spending growth, they write, that we're seeing under Obama. Big spending was a key cause of Bush's failure as president, both economically and politically, and they said it is proving just as damaging under unpopular under Obama. I explained in Liberty and Tyranny. If you look at FDR, and if you look at his Republican predecessor, Hoover set the stage for FDR, just as Bush 43 set the stage for Obama. Bush had the worst spending record in American history before Obama. It's just the way it is. His staffers are all over the place. They're spinning this stuff. They're on TV. They're on radio. They're here. They're there. They're everywhere. This is a fact. It's a painful fact, but it's a fact. Even if we take 9/11 spending out of it, even if we take the Vietnam War out of spending under LBJ, under Kennedy, LBJ, and Nixon, even if we take the spending and increases under Reagan for defense to defeat the Soviets and win the Cold War, we take all those elements out and we basically look at domestic spending and the welfare state and entitlements. So when they say the people made a decision, when they say just give us power back, ladies and gentlemen, the issue is to whom do we give power? Obviously the Democrats, no way. They've surrendered all notion of fiscal sanity and constitutionalism. They're pushing their own unconstitutional, profligate agenda. They're gone. They're lost. They're out of control. But the Republicans are neo-statists, which I also explained in Liberty and Tyranny. And for the most part, they just keep growing the government. With really one president since the New Deal who slowed it down, and rather than build on his accomplishments, which were not perfect, Bush 41 chose to lurch back to the FDR example. Bush 43 lurched back to the FDR example. Oh, yes, we had tax cuts, but that's not enough. You've got to control spending, control the size of government, respect the Constitution. Mitch McConnell, Lamar Alexander, John Boehner, Eric Cantor have shown no indications that they are of the same mindset as Ronald Reagan. They're not. And they've demonstrated that, and so have most of their colleagues in the prior administration. I know this is painful. I know other hosts aren't going to do this. But if I don't do it, ladies and gentlemen, who will? This is the truth. It's unvarnished, but it's the truth. This is why John Boehner today really exposed who he is, his heart and soul, when he lashed out against conservatives. This is who McConnell is when he exposes himself and lashes out against conservatives, tries to take it back, step back, but really despises conservatives. And same with the rest. This is why the Republican Study Committee today, which 99% of you never heard of before, and why would you? Which is was established as the conservative heart and soul within the Republican House of Representatives. This is why it's no longer so, because the Republican leadership just wiped out the executive director of that entity. It doesn't really even matter, really, who his name is. If you don't know who Paul Teller is, just that you know they went after somebody who was a patriot, who worked very, very hard on behalf of conservatives. And part of his job was conservative outreach to conservative groups. That's why they took him down. They wanted to critically damage this organization. And by putting this guy, this Congressman Steve Scalise in there, a Boehner lackey, a Republican from Louisiana, well, they've accomplished their goal. So today I just want you to know the House of Representatives lashed out against you through the Speaker, internally through their own bureaucratic ways, just purged the Republican Study Committee. Just consider it the Conservative Republican Committee. That's what it's supposed to be. And all for what? A budget deal that's Mickey Mouse. When will they put the people first? When will they look at what we look at and say that some things are worth fighting for? You don't have to fight, ladies and gentlemen, if you control the presidency, the Senate, and the House. You have to fight when you don't. That's what makes a leader. That's what a leader is. It's somebody who can do something that's unexpected, who can move a nation, who can change the trajectory. The fact that these men, mostly men right now in Washington, work their way up the ladder of leadership, cutting deals, using PAC money to support candidates who get elected and then get their vote for leadership positions, learn the ways of backstabbing and undermining and leaking and all the rest of it, that doesn't make a leader. That makes a climber. And that's what we have now, climbers, not leaders. I'm sorry to be the one to explain this. I mean, it's much easier to do what I'm sure I don't listen to most of them, but what do most of these other hosts do, which attack Obama, attack Democrats, attack liberals. I take second place to no one in that regard, period. But that's not enough. You got to be a little more substantive. You got to be a little bit more thoughtful and realistic about what's actually going on. It's not enough just to defeat the left, and believe me, they must be crushed. But we have to defeat the neo-statists, who kind of like big government. They really have no intention of repealing Obamacare, and replace them with people who do. So when people say to me, Mark, what would you do? Well, these are people that don't listen to this program or read what I write. It's obvious. I would advance our principles through principled people. No, we're not going to win every race. We're not going to control every Congress. That's obvious. But we do what we can. And we also look to other means under our Constitution, to rehabilitating our Constitution, reestablishing our republic, and empowering you and me, the American people. And if you think that's going to come on from down high, to the people who've designed this monstrosity, who are fighting over $23 billion over 10 years, while spending over $90 trillion in unfunded liabilities, then you have another thing coming.